You never expect war to start over tomatoes and windows. But when Karen became our HOA president, the line between neighborly concern and tyrannical control blurred so fast that by the time we realized what was happening, it was too late for most, but not for me. If you think HOA horror stories are exaggerated, if you think one person can't destroy your peace, your property, and your sense of safety, then stick with this one and subscribe to Sham Stories, because I promise what happened in Oak Timber Lane will make you question every smiling face in your neighborhood. It started small, as it always does, with a welcome basket on our porch. My wife and I had just moved into the sleepy cul-de-sac after finally finding the kind of home we could imagine raising a family in. Modest fenced yard, a small greenhouse, to build a view of the trees from the kitchen window. My wife, Taylor, was 6 months pregnant, glowing and hopeful. And Yvonne was recently retired after a decade in data analysis for a cybersecurity firm. We'd come here for peace, but Karen Preston had no interest in letting anyone enjoy that. She greeted us that first day like a politician, smiling a bit too hard, asking too many questions, and leaving us with a laminated pamphlet about HOA bylaws that had been updated just 2 weeks earlier, all signed by her in crisp black ink. I didn't think much of it at first. Rules were rules. But even in those first weeks, I noticed how neighbors avoided eye contact when she was nearby, how their greetings turned stiff or vanished when Karen rounded a corner during her afternoon compliance walks. Still, we kept to ourselves, focusing on the baby's room, gardening the back corner, and prepping the spot where my wife had dreamed of placing a small greenhouse for year-round herbs and tomatoes. We submitted our HOA form to begin backyard improvement. Just a standard structure, 10 by 12 feet, clear panels, wooden frame, nothing flashy. Karen rejected it within 24 hours, with a note, environmental risk unapproved structure. Property values at risk. I appealed politely, asked if she'd review the plans with me, even offered to scale it down. She said the board would vote. The board, apparently, consisted of 2 people she appointed herself and 1 neighbor who hadn't shown up for a meeting in months. The greenhouse was rejected again. That was the first warning. The second came 2 weeks later when we received a $75 fine for yard non-uniformity. I walked outside, looked at our perfectly mowed grass, identical to the neighbors on either side, and shook my head. Karen, clipboard in hand, was already down the street pretending not to see me. I installed security cameras the next day. Taylor thought I was being paranoid. But I knew the difference between firm leadership and targeting, and this felt like the latter. I started tracking her visit times, days notes she left taped to mailboxes. She wasn't documenting problems. She was building a narrative. 1 week after the cameras went up, she called the city on us, claiming we were storing hazardous gardening materials in the yard. When the inspector arrived and saw nothing but soil bags and mulch, he apologized and left. Karen, of course, said she was only looking out for the community. The neighbors whispered more now. I caught snippets at the mailbox outside garages. Did she fine you too? We just paid it. Not worth the fight. Don't bring it up, she finds out. Then one Saturday afternoon, it escalated. The neighborhood kids were playing outside while several families gathered in the common area for what used to be our annual community potluck, a tradition slowly dying since Karen took office. This time, though, people had organized it without her. Food trucks lined the street, laughter returned, and for once, Oak Timber Lane felt like a neighborhood again. That's when it happened. A 7-year-old boy tripped near our fence. He scraped his knee, cried a little, then ran to his dad. 5 minutes later, Karen was on our doorstep holding her phone. I saw what happened. You don't have safety tape around that yard. You're in violation. That boy could have been seriously injured. We're lucky it wasn't worse. I blinked, stunned. Are you kidding me? I asked. It's grass. The kid tripped over a root. She snapped a photo of the side yard and added, You'll be receiving an official notice. If I were you, I'd think about relocating. This neighborhood needs responsible residents. I didn't yell. I didn't threaten. I simply walked inside, pulled the security footage, and saved it. The boy tripped on a football and fell 2 feet from our fence, not even close. But the next day, we received a formal violation letter marked Level 3 safety violation. Pending review, Karen had escalated it to the city's Nuisance Property Department. That's when I realized she wasn't just being strict. She was building a case to force us out. Over the next 3 weeks, we received 4 more fines. One for non-standard curtain color visible from the street, another for plant growth interfering with HOA visual standards, one for improper mailbox hinge angle, and one for light reflection hazard from our upstairs window, which I later discovered came from the sun bouncing off a picture frame at exactly 5:37 p.m. for about 3 seconds. I appealed each one. She denied them all. I began researching. I pulled the last 5 years of HOA meeting minutes. 1-page PDFs, vague and clearly edited by the same hand. I filed a Freedom of Information request for communications between the HOA and the city. What came back chilled. Mekarin had filed over 60 formal complaints against different households in the last year alone, many citing potential legal concern or perceived threat to neighborhood equity. Most of them had quietly paid, moved, or given up. She had created a pattern, a fear machine cloaked in policy. But I wasn't going anywhere. I created a digital log of everything. Her visits, timestamps, the fines, the appeals, the camera footage, the city filings, and I cross-referenced it all. Karen was using her position to cite concerns and push people toward fines and compliance then. Later recommending realtors connected to her cousin for discreet buyouts. She was flipping the neighborhood house by house. My wife and I became a wall she couldn't push down, and that's when she started getting sloppy. She filed a claim saying we were planning to build a shed without HOA approval wrong. Then, she claimed we left trash bins out too long again. The camera said otherwise. I sent documentation to the board, to the city, even to the HOA insurance provider. No one acted. That's when I realized we needed the community. One by one, I reached out to the neighbors she'd quietly threatened. I showed them my data. I gave them copies of their own fines and her patterns of behavior. We formed a group, chat, then a private meeting at the park, then a coalition, called it Oak Freedom. Over 20 families joined. One neighbor, a retired lawyer, offered to help with legal challenges. Another, a local reporter, said he'd quietly start compiling for an expose, and then one day we received the final blow. Karen had submitted a petition to have our property declared a public nuisance zone, claiming our greenhouse materials were contaminated with chemical fertilizers that could pose a threat to neighboring yards and children. It was a lie. We used organic compost. But the petition triggered a 14-day investigation window, and if approved, the city could place a lien on our property. Karen was no longer just annoying. She was dangerous. But she made a mistake. She left a printed copy of the petition in my mailbox, and in the margins were notes she hadn't erased. Push before September baby due then. It's easier to force. A move. She had weaponized my wife's pregnancy against us. That was it. No more quiet resistance. I gathered every neighbor willing to speak, every file, every video. And we drafted a 47-page formal complaint and delivered it in person to the city's oversight board with signatures from 18 households and documentation going back 2 years. The city placed an immediate hold on Karen's petition. The story went public the next day. The morning after the story went public, Oak Timber Lane was buzzing like it hadn't in years. Not since before Karen's reign turned the neighborhood into a patchwork of fear and fake smiles. The article, published under the title HOA President, accused of targeting residents and forcing sales, hit the local digital press and was shared across the county within hours. Photos of violation notices, redacted fines, and snippets of Karen's handwriting appeared in side-by-side comparisons with our complaint documents, and the evidence was damning. It wasn't just our family anymore. It was now a public scandal. And for the first time, Karen couldn't control the narrative. That morning, she didn't take her usual walk. Her beige visor, clipboard, and tan windbreaker were noticeably absent from the sidewalks she used to patrol like a general surveying her troops. Instead, her curtains stayed drawn, and her SUV remained in the driveway unmoved. But her silence didn't slow the momentum. Neighbors I had barely spoken to before approached me with quiet nods and whispered gratitude. One man 2 houses over, who'd always seemed reclusive, stopped me at my mailbox and said, "She made my son take down his treehouse. Said it was a visibility hazard. I never forgot that." Another neighbor, Mia, who had moved in just last year, shared that Karen had refused her porch paint request 3 times. Until she agreed to switch to a vendor, the HOA recommended a contractor that turned out to be Karen's brother-in-law. The stories kept pouring in. We compiled them all, creating a detailed neighborhood-wide affidavit that expanded our case far beyond just my backyard. We had stories of emotional manipulation, threats disguised as reminders, and violations used to pressure elderly residents into downsizing or selling. The most heartbreaking came from a woman named Diane, who had recently lost her husband. She revealed that Karen had shown up with a sympathy card and a pamphlet for a retirement community she claimed would be less stressful than maintaining a house. Anne hadn't asked for help. She hadn't even told the HOA about her husband's passing. Karen had found out through public records and showed up 2 days after the obituary was published. That was Karen's real power, not in rules or fines, but in emotional exploitation wrapped in official-looking envelopes and flowery language. But now, stripped of her invisibility, Karen was cornered. The city scheduled an emergency review hearing to determine whether the HOA board had violated procedural ethics and whether Karen had acted beyond the legal limits of her authority. For the first time, residents were invited to testify, not just through written statements, but in person. I was asked to speak first. I wore a plain navy button-up, brought my printed files in a simple folder, and refused to exaggerate or dramatize. I told them about the greenhouse, the fake violations, the city filings, the targeting during my wife's pregnancy, and the note Karen left by mistake. I spoke for 12 minutes, ending with a single line. "We didn't come here to fight. We came here to live." She gave us no choice. Taylor sat in the back, her hand on her stomach, face calm but pale. Several other residents followed. Joseph, the veteran, described how Karen had fined him for hanging a flag at a non-HOA-approved angle. He had paid it out of frustration. Rachel, the young mother down the street, described how Karen had cited her for improper seasonal decor after her kids chalked smiley faces on the sidewalk in summer. Each story chipped away at the veneer Karen had worn so comfortably for years. And yet, when it was her turn to speak, she arrived in full form-pressed khaki blazer, pastel, scarf, and that same overly controlled smile. She denied everything, claimed she was being singled out for enforcing long-standing community standards. She called the article a coordinated smear campaign driven by resentment over personal property violations. But her voice trembled. Only once, when she accused me, specifically, of organizing an emotional coup to dismantle a system of structure and safety. But the board wasn't buying it. The city had already confirmed that several of her documents had been altered, some even backdated. The investigation revealed she had full administrative control over the HOA software, something never approved by the full board. A subpoena to the HOA's tech provider confirmed that Karen had requested features allowing her to edit complaint logs, override votes, and suppress member emails from being distributed to other residents. She'd essentially run a private, shadow version of the HOA for nearly 2 years. As her control unraveled, her tone changed. She grew defensive, bitter, accusatory. She blamed emotional residents, low civic engagement, and inconsistent city oversight. But when asked why so many violations were dismissed after residents filed appeals directly to the city, she fell silent. The review ended with a formal recommendation. Karen was to be suspended from the HOA board immediately, pending final judgment. Her access to HOA accounts was revoked, and a third-party management firm was appointed to review all HOA operations. For the past 24 months. That afternoon, Karen's name was removed from the HOA portal. Her driveway remained empty. For a while, it seemed like we had one. But Karen wasn't finished. The next morning, several residents, including Miras, received a legal notice from a private law firm claiming defamation and group coercion, resulting in undue psychological harm. Karen had filed a civil suit against 7 families, accusing us of organizing a neighborhood harassment campaign that led to her suspension. It was a desperate move, a legal last breath. But it forced us to respond formally. We pooled resources and hired a single legal team to represent all 7 families. Our attorney, a woman named Nuisance, was sharp, calm, and surgical in her strategy. She called the suit a textbook act of retaliation and began working to have it dismissed under the state's anti-SLAPP law's strategic lawsuit against public participation. Meanwhile, the HOA management firm began sending out surveys, real ones, anonymous, third-party reviewed, to gauge the community's trust, concerns, and interest in reform. Nearly 90% of respondents voted in favor of dissolving the current board structure entirely and replacing it with a rotating council, term limits, and a public voting system. Oak Timber Lane was changing not just in law, but in spirit. It was no longer Karen's kingdom. But then, one night, as I was reviewing footage from my front camera system, I saw something that gave me pause. At 3:17 a.m., a car I didn't recognize slowly drove past the house twice. Then a figure exited, walked near my fence, and placed something on our mailbox. It was a man, not Karen, wearing a hoodie and gloves. By morning, the item was gone. But the footage gave me a chill. I posted a still image to the community forum, warning others to check their mailboxes and be alert. The man wasn't identified, but 2 other families reported seeing the same car on different nights. It became clear Karen might be pulling strings from the shadows, using proxies, perhaps trying to intimidate or collect information. We submitted the footage to police. They began a formal investigation. Our lawyer amended the civil defense, filing to include a request for restraining orders if needed. But the most unexpected turn came the next week. A city official contacted me and asked if I'd be willing to sit on a newly proposed HOA oversight committee, a county-level group, meant to investigate other neighborhoods showing signs of governance abuse. Apparently, our case had become a model for deeper structural reform. I agreed under one condition: that it remain voluntary, non-political, and built to empower residents, not replace Karen with another version of her. They agreed. And suddenly, this quiet little street, once controlled by a woman with a clipboard and a thirst for control, had become a catalyst for change across the county. But peace still felt distant. I couldn't shake the feeling that Karen wasn't done, not truly. The lawsuit loomed, the strange car incident hung over us, and whispers of her planning to move out strategically to avoid certain charges left us guessing. I kept my cameras running. I taught Taylor how to use the Panic app linked to our local police. I knew the storm wasn't over yet, but I also knew this: Karen had underestimated us. She'd mistaken politeness for submission, silence for consent. What she didn't know was that we weren't just defending our yard anymore. We were defending our right to live without fear, without manipulation, and without someone weaponizing the rules against us. And the next time she tried anything, she'd find a neighborhood united, not afraid. As summer reached its peak and the grass turned gold beneath the sun's weight, Oak Timber Lane carried the strange stillness of a neighborhood between battles. Karen's civil suit hadn't yet been dismissed, but it was floundering. Our defense. Attorney Jean Nuisance had submitted a meticulous anti-SLAPP motion backed by signed affidavits, footage, and even financial documentation from the new HOA management firm showing Karen had misused discretionary funds. Despite the slow court process, confidence in the community was returning. For the first time in nearly 2 years, residents started talking to each other without glancing over their shoulders. Barbecues returned, children played past dusk, and people no longer whispered the word violation like it was cursed. But while the surface calmed, I remained on edge. I reviewed camera footage nightly, logged any strange vehicles, and even rigged a backup battery to the outdoor lights in case someone tried cutting power. Then one evening, Taylor called me to the nursery window. "She's back," she said. Simply, there across the street, Karen was standing in her front yard, watering plants with a look so calm it was almost theatrical. Her hair was pulled into a tight bun, her posture deliberate, her eyes occasionally scanning across the street toward us. She hadn't been seen outside in nearly a month, And now, just days before the anti-slap hearing, she returned to her routine like nothing had happened. I kept watching, expecting her to glance our way, to scowl or even wave sarcastically. But she never did. She just watered her roses and went inside. That quiet reappearance felt like a message, I'm not done. 2 days later, Diane, the widow Karen, had once tried to push into a retirement home, found her garden fence broken, and a small pile of mulch dumped near her porch with no useful explanation. Now, it wasn't malicious enough to call the police, but it wasn't nothing either. The message was clear, you're not invisible. Then, a resident named Tim received an anonymous tip that his fence was 6 inches over the HOA line, which triggered a property boundary check by the HOA's previous vendor. The vendor claimed Karen had asked them to review properties months ago, but the orders had never been officially withdrawn. It was subtle harassment, just enough to spook people, but not enough to link directly back to her. Meanwhile, the HOA management firm released the first phase of their internal audit findings. In the span of 18 months, Karen had issued 112 citations, approved 21 vendor contracts without full board review, and personally received over $18,000 in reimbursements without itemized receipts. The report didn't just expose wrongdoing. It painted a picture of someone who had used HOA authority as a personal toolbox for retaliation, profit, and control. Evelyn Grant, the journalist who had broken the original article, returned to Oak Timber Lane to cover the developments. This time, she wasn't working alone. A larger regional paper had picked up the story, and they were interested in making it part of a series on HOA corruption. She asked to interview several residents again, including me. Agreed on one condition: I wanted them to hear from Taylor. So while I had gathered the evidence and organized the resistance, Taylor had lived with the anxiety, the stress, during pregnancy, and the fear that a neighbor might be trying to force her out of her home. During the interview, she sat on our back porch, calm and composed, and told them about the day we got the first violation, how Karen's wording had been friendly but laced with warning. She told them about the silent tension on the street, the fake smiles, and how her hands shook every time she saw Karen's SUV pass our window. It was like being stalked with paperwork, she said. That quote made it to the headline. The article went viral. HOA forums across the country picked it up. Thousands of comments flooded in from people who'd experienced similar things: power-hungry board members, illegal fines, threats disguised as policy. Suddenly, Oak Timber Lane wasn't just a cautionary tale, it was a rallying cry. Then, the court date for Karen's civil suit arrived. Our attorney laid everything out calmly and with brutal precision. She showed that Karen's claims of harassment had no basis, that our meetings had been peaceful, our protests legal, and our evidence irrefutable. Karen's attorney attempted to shift blame, claiming the violations were part of a misunderstood governance process, but even the judge seemed unimpressed. In the end, the motion was granted. The suit was dismissed. Karen was ordered to pay our legal fees. It was a legal blow, and Karen felt it. The next morning, she posted a public letter on the HOA portal. She framed it as a farewell message, stating she would be moving to a new community where growth and order are still respected. She didn't mention the lawsuit, the audit, or the mountain of evidence that had unraveled her power. Instead, she blamed a cultural shift in the neighborhood and emotional decision-making replacing policy. But her tone was bitter, detached, and defeated. She was gone by the end of the week. A moving truck arrived early one morning. A man, possibly a relative, loaded boxes. Karen didn't say goodbye to anyone. No one came to help. As the truck pulled away, several residents stood outside silently, not to gloat, but to witness the end of something. It wasn't joy, it was relief. But just as we exhaled, something unexpected happened. The county legal board reached out to several residents, including myself, with a formal request: would we be willing to participate in a pilot program aimed at HOA oversight training for new community board members? They wanted Oak Timber Lane to serve as a case study, one that could help reshape how HOAs operated across the state. After a meeting with Glenn, the newly elected HOA chair, and a few others, we agreed to participate. Not because we wanted recognition, but because we didn't want this to happen to anyone else. Training modules were developed, interviews were conducted, a community panel was formed to review all future changes to the HOA's charter, and slowly, piece by piece, we built something that had never existed under Karen's rule: trust. That trust had to be earned. One evening, I held a small gathering in our backyard, the very yard that had once been labeled a nuisance zone. We invited neighbors, old and new, grilled burgers, shared stories, and even set up a projector to watch home videos of community events from years ago. Someone brought up the old potlucks, and laughter broke out when we remembered how Karen used to complain if the dessert table didn't have a uniform cloth color. The trauma faded, softened by the warmth of unity. But I still kept the footage, I still kept the folders. Not out of paranoia, but principle. Because systems don't just stay clean, they require constant watchfulness. Karen may have left, but the scars she left behind were reminders that unchecked authority, no matter how small, can grow into something dangerous when no one's paying attention. And Oak Timber Lane, now more than ever, was paying attention. For a time after Karen left Oak Timber Lane, there was a kind of peace no one dared to speak aloud, as if saying it might invite her spirit back through the gates, clipboard in hand. The neighborhood took a breath, and the atmosphere genuinely shifted. Conversations returned to porches. Kids played without being supervised for compliance. And people no longer hesitated to put out lawn gnomes or fly flags that weren't HOA approved. The board underwent a transformation too. Glenn stepped up not just as a placeholder, but as a real leader, transparent, mild-mannered, and determined to bring accountability into a system that had been ruled by fear. Weekly emails included meeting summaries with timestamps. All votes were recorded, and board positions were now rotating annually, with term limits enforced by new bylaws. What had once been a rigid, manipulated power structure had become a functioning, democratic entity. And yet beneath all that optimism, quiet suspicion lingered among some of us. Karen may have left physically, but she didn't strike us as the kind to vanish without a trace. Our hunch was soon proven right. A month after she moved, I received a notification from a Google alert I'd set long ago tied to Karen's full name. The alert linked to a recent filing in a neighboring town's HOA registry. Karen Preston, now listed as KL Preston, had registered as a community consultant for a new HOA formation committee in a subdivision still under development. She hadn't just moved, she was setting herself up to do it all again, just under a slightly altered name. I forwarded the filing to Glenn, who verified it with the state's corporate registry. The LLC she was working under Blue Birch compliance. Services was newly formed, and the paperwork had been filed the week she left our neighborhood. I reached out to Evelyn, the journalist, who quickly dug deeper. Through public records and backchannel tips, she uncovered that Karen had also been connected to 2 other HOA groups in nearby counties under similar aliases, each time staying just long enough to influence policy formation before resigning. For health reasons or personal obligations, it was a disturbing pattern. Establish control, bend rules, exploit fear, then slip away before full exposure. Evelyn compiled her findings and published a long-form article titled "The HOA Nomad: How One Woman Quietly Controlled Communities Through Fear and Fine Print." The piece went viral statewide, sparking debates about oversight in new housing developments. HOA forums lit up with warnings about consultants and early charter drafts that gave too much unilateral control to one person. Meanwhile, Oak Timber Lane, now seen as a success story, began receiving letters from other communities asking for help, advice, and even sample documents for reform. Glenn coordinated a public webinar hosted from our clubhouse, where board members from other neighborhoods could ask questions and learn how we rebuilt our system from the inside out. Our sleepy cul-de-sac had become a model of resistance. But amid the celebration, something strange happened. Taylor, now in her 3rd trimester, noticed unfamiliar cars driving slowly past our house again twice in 1 week. At first, we brushed it off. Could have been new realtors or residents getting the lay of the land. But then one morning, we woke to find an envelope slid under our front door. No stamp, no name, just typed words on a single sheet of paper. "You may have one, but you don't control the story." That phrase sent a chill through both of us. It wasn't threatening on the surface, but the implication was unmistakable. I checked our security system footage, but whoever left the note had approached from the side yard, masked, and stayed. Out of camera range, I filed a police report. We were sympathetic but honest. Without a direct threat or clearer footage, they couldn't do much. Still, they increased patrols in our area, and the officer I spoke to advised me to remain vigilant. We upgraded our cameras again and installed motion-triggered spotlights on every side of the house. I wasn't afraid for myself, but Taylor was weeks from delivery, and I refused to let even the shadow of Karen's presence put her under stress. We reinforced the neighborhood watch with a rotating schedule, and several neighbors volunteered to keep an eye out during late hours. The Oak Freedom Group remained active, now with over 30 members, each helping monitor subtle changes, new documents, and strange occurrences. Then came the biggest surprise of all. One morning, Glenn called an emergency HOA meeting. Curious residents gathered at the clubhouse where Glenn stood beside a tall, nervous-looking man in a gray blazer. He introduced himself as David Ellis, a representative from the State Housing Oversight Committee. They decided, based on Evelyn's reporting and the legal precedent set by our case, to propose a pilot state-funded program that would allow neighborhoods to implement a permanent third-party compliance auditor and official outside the HOA chosen by residents to prevent abuse. Oak Timber Lane had been selected to be the first test site. It was unprecedented. We were offered a full year of oversight funding and a review team to help residents vote on charter changes that would protect against any future Karen-style governance. The room erupted into applause. We'd started out battling fines over lawn colors and greenhouse panels, and now we were changing the way HOAs might work across the state. But not all the effects of Karen's departure were positive. Some residents remained nervous, especially after word of the letter got around. A few people quietly sold their homes, choosing to start fresh somewhere completely new. One elderly couple who had been quietly fined out of nearly $4,000 over a span of 2 years said they just couldn't enjoy the street anymore. It reminded them too much of the fear. It was a reminder that victory doesn't always mean healing. For everyone, some wounds just go too deep. Taylor finally gave birth to our daughter on a sunny Friday morning in September. We named her Clara. We came home 2 days later to a surprising sight. Nearly every porch on our block had been decorated with simple white ribbons and flower baskets. It wasn't organized through a message or email. It was just something the neighborhood did, quietly, to welcome Clara home. Taylor cried when she saw it. So did I. In that moment, the stress, the surveillance, the fines, the hearings, it all felt worth it. But I knew the work wasn't over. Karen had simply moved on to her next target, and somewhere, another neighborhood was about to meet her consulting services. Evelyn's next article included her full identity, listing every known alias, LLC, and address she'd used over the past decade. It painted a clear portrait of a serial manipulator, someone addicted to control and enabled by the lack of oversight in HOA systems nationwide. The article was picked up by a national investigative podcast. Karen Preston, once just a neighbor with a clipboard, had become a symbol of everything broken in HOA governance. But here on Oak Timber Lane, we weren't scared of her anymore. We had faced her, fought her, exposed her, and if she ever tried to come back, we'd be waiting not with fear, but with policy, structure, and solidarity. Because we'd learned that the real power of a community wasn't in rules or meetings. It was in knowing your neighbors, trusting them, standing beside them when it mattered most. That's what Karen never understood. That's why she lost. 6 months after Clara was born, the town of Maple Row, 40 minutes east of us, held an emergency community meeting over allegations that a newly formed HOA board had been issuing surprise fines without board approval or resident notice. I didn't even have to read the second paragraph to know who was behind it. The article didn't say her full name, just initials, but it was enough. K.L. Preston, listed as a compliance consultant, had helped write the charter. That was Karen. She'd done it against, lipped into a vulnerable community with no strong structure, and begun her favorite game, control from the shadows. Only this time, the story didn't end the way she planned. Residents in Maple Row had already heard of us. One of their board members had attended Glenn's webinar. Another had read Evelyn's expose. They recognized the signs early. And this time, the neighborhood pushed back before Karen could fully embed herself. They submitted a collective request to suspend the entire board and hired a local governance attorney to audit every document she'd touched. Within days, Karen disappeared again. But her name wasn't so easy to erase now. There were blogs warning of her tactics, watch lists forming among HOA watchdog groups, and even lawmakers citing her case in proposals for new homeowner protection laws. She'd gone from a name on a violation form to a symbol of everything broken and unchecked. Community leadership. And in some strange way, that gave me hope. Back in Oak Timber Lane, life continued with the kind of joy that only comes when you've rebuilt something from ashes. Our daughter took her first steps beneath the same backyard tree that once nearly triggered a nuisance violation. Taylor smiled more no genuine. Relaxed, and every so often I'd catch her staring at the garden beds she'd once considered tearing up because of the stress. She never said it out loud, but I knew what she was thinking. We kept our home, kept each other. The neighborhood's HOA structure was now one of the most transparent in the state. And our rotating board system had become a reference point for over 20 other communities. Even the state's Housing Oversight Committee had implemented new training programs directly inspired by our case. It wasn't about ego, it wasn't about punishment. It was about making sure no one else had to go through what we had. One evening, Glenn stopped by with a worn-out manila envelope.
Thought you should have this, he said. Inside were the original copies of every violation Karen had issued to our household. Smugly worded each.
Signed in her flawless, curling handwriting, and realized they no longer held power over me. They were just reminders. Proof that tyranny can wear pastels and smile through your window. We had beaten her not with revenge, but with truth, with unity, with policy. Still, I kept the folder in a locked cabinet. Not out of fear, but out of responsibility, because I knew someday someone else might knock on our door with questions. With confusion, with a thick envelope marked notice of violation that felt more like a threat than a reminder. And when that day comes, I want to be ready. I want to hand them the full story. Because the most dangerous thing about a Karen is not how loud she is, it's how quietly she builds. Her power, while the rest of us are trying to live our lives. But if this story has taught you anything, if the fights, the hearings, the documents, the sleepless nights, and the quiet victories moved you even a little, then remember this. Subscribe to the Sham Stories YouTube channel. Karen might be closer than you think, and someone out there needs to hear how we stood a panned one.